On October 14, 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in the hallway of his home in Herlingen, Germany, and spoke his final words to his 15-year-old son, Manfred. In a quarter of an hour, he said quietly, "I shall be dead." Two generals from Berlin, Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Maisel, waited outside in a dark green car. They had brought a cyanide capsule and an ultimatum from Adolf Hitler, the Desert Fox, the commander who had terrorized British forces across North Africa, the general who had handed American troops their worst defeat of the war, was about to take his own life at the age of 52. But before Rommel walked out that door for the last time, he had left behind something that would challenge assumptions for decades to come. In his papers, in his letters to his wife Lucy, in his official military reports, the legendary German commander had recorded his professional assessment of American military leadership. What he wrote contradicted everything his superiors in Berlin believed. It defied the racial ideology at the heart of Nazi thinking. And it revealed that one of Germany's most celebrated field marshals had recognized a truth that Adolf Hitler refused to accept. Rommel believed the Americans would become formidable opponents. He said so while other German generals dismissed them as soft and poorly led. He documented their rapid improvement while Nazi propaganda portrayed them as racially inferior. He warned that Germany could not win against their industrial power, while Hitler insisted that martial spirit would triumph over material abundance. This is the story of how one German commander saw what his leaders could not see, and why his surprisingly respectful assessment of American generals would prove far more accurate than anyone in the Nazi high command wanted to believe. The contempt for America began at the very top of the Nazi regime. On January 7, 1942, Adolf Hitler sat at his military headquarters in East Prussia, a compound hidden in the forests that he called the Wolf's Lair. During one of his rambling dinner conversations that staff members recorded and later compiled into what became known as Hitler's table talk, the Führer delivered his verdict on the United States. According to notes attributed to Hitler from this period, though historians have raised questions about the reliability of these reconstructed records, he declared that he did not see much future for the Americans. "It is a decayed country," the notes record him saying. "They have their racial problem and the problem of social inequalities. Everything about the behavior of American society reveals that it is half Judaized and the other half negrified. How could one expect a state like that to hold together?" This was not simply an offhand remark. This was Nazi ideology speaking. Hitler genuinely believed that national strength flowed from racial purity and homogeneity. Germany, with its supposed Aryan bloodline, possessed an inherent superiority that would manifest on the battlefield. America, a mongrel nation of immigrants and minorities mixing together in what Hitler considered biological chaos, could not possibly match the martial spirit of the German Volk. The Führer had expressed similar views in Mein Kampf nearly 2 decades earlier. His contempt for American racial mixing was foundational to his worldview. And because Hitler's beliefs shaped German strategy, this racial analysis would have catastrophic consequences for the German war effort. Hitler's military advisors reinforced his prejudices with intelligence assessments that confirmed what he already believed. German reports on American military capacity in the late 1930s painted a picture of comprehensive weakness. The United States Army in 1939 numbered fewer than 190,000 men, ranking 19th in size among the world's militaries. The Army of Portugal was larger. American factories produced consumer goods like automobiles and refrigerators, not the tanks and aircraft that modern warfare demanded. American military spending had been minimal throughout the long years of the Great Depression. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that the United States would produce 50,000 military aircraft per year, the German High Command dismissed the claim as propaganda fantasy. American military aircraft production in 1939 had totaled roughly 2,500 planes. The notion that this could increase by a factor of 20 struck German planners as absurd. They understood what aircraft production required: the precision manufacturing, the specialized alloys and metals, the trained workforce with years of experience. America had none of these capabilities in place. Hermann Goering, the corpulent commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest confidants, was particularly contemptuous of American industrial claims. Goering had built the German Air Force from nothing after the Treaty of Versailles restrictions were abandoned. He understood the technical challenges of producing modern combat aircraft. The idea that Americans, whom he considered culturally unsophisticated and racially degraded, could mass-produce advanced military equipment struck him as laughable. Goering's dismissiveness would later prove to be one of the most consequential misjudgments of the war. The numbers would tell their own story. By 1943, American factories were producing over 84,000 military aircraft annually. By 1944, that number would exceed 96,000. The total American aircraft production during the war would reach nearly 300,000 planes. The claims that Goering dismissed as fantasy would prove to be understatements. The German generals who had fought Americans in the First World War reinforced the assumption of American military weakness. In 1918, American troops had arrived in France late in the conflict and performed adequately but not spectacularly. They had suffered relatively light casualties compared to the European powers that had been bleeding for 4 years. They had contributed little to the strategic direction of the war. The memory of those inexperienced doughboys reinforced the belief that Americans lacked the hardness required for sustained combat against professional German soldiers. Albert Speer, who would later become Hitler's Minister of Armaments and one of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany, was present for many of the Führer's dinner conversations about America. Hitler believed that Americans had not played a prominent part in the war of 1914 to 1918, Speer later recalled. They had not made great sacrifices of blood. Hitler was convinced they would not withstand a real trial by fire because their fighting qualities were low. In general, he said, no such thing as an American people existed as a unit. They were nothing but a mass of immigrants from many nations and races. Nicolaus von Below, Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant who attended many of these conversations, later expressed astonishment at his leader's cluelessness about the military potential of the United States. The men closest to Hitler could see that his racial theories were blinding him to strategic reality, but few dared to contradict him openly. Erwin Rommel absorbed some of these assumptions as he rose through the German military hierarchy. Born in November 1891 in Heidenheim, in the Kingdom of Württemberg, Rommel had distinguished himself as a young infantry officer in the First World War. His exploits in the Italian campaign, where he led a small force to capture thousands of prisoners through audacious mountain warfare, earned him Germany's highest military decoration, the Pour le Mérite. After the war, Rommel wrote a book about his infantry experiences titled Infantry Attacks. The book emphasized aggressive tactics, personal leadership at the front, and the importance of speed and surprise. It became a standard text at German military academies and brought Rommel to the attention of Adolf Hitler, who admired his aggressive philosophy of war. When the Second World War began, Rommel commanded Hitler's personal security detail during the Polish campaign. In 1940, he was given command of the 7th Panzer Division for the invasion of France. His division advanced so rapidly through the French countryside that it earned the nickname Ghost Division, because even German headquarters often lost track of its location. Rommel's aggressive leadership style and willingness to take personal risks produced spectacular results. In February 1941, Hitler sent Rommel to North Africa to rescue the Italian forces that had been routed by the British. Commanding a small force that would become known as the Afrika Korps, Rommel launched an offensive that drove the British back across Libya. His success earned him promotion to Field Marshal and the nickname Desert Fox for his cunning tactics and rapid maneuvers. For nearly 2 years, Rommel fought the British Eighth Army across the deserts of Libya and Egypt. He developed a deep respect for his opponents, particularly the Australian and New Zealand troops who proved stubborn fighters. But he also developed tactics that repeatedly defeated British forces, despite their numerical superiority. Rommel believed in leading from the front, often commanding from a tank or armoured car right at the point of contact, rather than from a headquarters miles behind the lines. His personal presence at critical moments frequently turned the tide of battle. In November 1942, the strategic situation in North Africa changed fundamentally. American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch, opening a second front against the Axis powers in the Mediterranean. Rommel, who had been fighting British forces alone for nearly 2 years, now faced a new enemy from the west. The American forces that landed in North Africa were green, in ways that only combat would reveal. Many of the officers and soldiers had never experienced warfare. Their equipment, while modern, had not been tested against German weapons. Their tactics were based on training manuals and peacetime exercises rather than battlefield experience. Their coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was theoretical rather than practiced under fire. Rommel recognized an opportunity. The American Second Corps held positions in central Tunisia, blocking the passes through the mountain ranges that divided the country. These inexperienced troops represented the weak point in the Allied line. If Rommel could smash through them, he might be able to drive a wedge between the American and British forces and defeat them in detail before they could coordinate their strength. On February 14, 1943, Rommel launched Operation Spring Breeze, beginning with attacks at Fide Pass and Sidi Bouzid. The broader offensive would culminate in the Battle of Kasserine Pass itself, which raged from February 19 through the 24th. This engagement would become the first major battle between American and German ground forces in the Second World War. It would also become a case study in military disaster. The American defenders were not prepared for what was about to hit them. German panzer divisions, veterans of 2 years of desert warfare, struck with the coordination and violence that Rommel had perfected. American units that had trained for years in peacetime conditions discovered that nothing had prepared them for the chaos of mechanized combat. Tanks that should have supported infantry were caught in carefully prepared ambushes and destroyed. Artillery batteries were overrun before they could relocate their guns. Communications collapsed as radio networks proved inadequate for the tempo of battle. The tactical failures multiplied with each passing hour. American commanders positioned their forces poorly, spreading units thin across wide frontages rather than concentrating strength at key defensive points. Reserves were held too far back to intervene when the front lines collapsed. Coordination between different units broke down completely. Some formations fought bravely in isolation, while others disintegrated under the pressure of the German assault. By February 19th, German forces had broken through Kasserine Pass itself. American troops fled in disorder down the roads leading west. Equipment was abandoned in the retreat. Tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces that American factories had worked months to produce fell into German hands intact. Prisoners were taken in large numbers. The defeat was comprehensive and deeply humiliating. Over the course of the battle, German and Italian forces inflicted more than 6,000 casualties on the American defenders, including roughly 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 captured. They destroyed or captured approximately 180 American tanks. They seized vast quantities of supplies, including food, fuel, and ammunition that the resource-starved Afrika Korps desperately needed. The American Second Corps had been mauled badly. Rommel himself was initially contemptuous of the American performance. The troops he faced at Kasserine seemed undisciplined and poorly led compared to the British and Commonwealth forces he had been fighting for 2 years. Their tactics were clumsy, their reactions were slow, their coordination between different arms was non-existent. The Green Americans appeared to confirm everything the German High Command believed about the fighting quality of racially impure nations. Reports of the victory at Kasserine filtered back to Berlin with triumphant enthusiasm. German intelligence officers compiled assessments that told Hitler exactly what he wanted to hear. The Americans were soft, just as the Führer had predicted. Their equipment was plentiful, but their soldiers lacked the warrior spirit that German troops possessed. The racial theories that underpinned Nazi ideology had been validated on the battlefield of Tunisia, but Rommel was too good a general, too careful an observer of military reality, to let initial impressions harden into permanent conclusions. Even as his forces exploited the American collapse, he noticed things that gave him pause. The American defeat had been comprehensive, yes, but it had not been complete in the way he expected. In certain sectors, American units had fought with unexpected determination before being overwhelmed. Artillery batteries that should have fled under attack had instead delivered accurate fire until they were physically overrun and their crews killed at their guns. Infantry formations that had been routed in the morning had somehow reorganized and launched counterattacks by afternoon. Individual soldiers who had never seen combat before in their lives had stood their ground against tanks with weapons that could not possibly stop them, dying in place rather than running. On February 22nd, Rommel's offensive reached its high water mark near the town of Thala. There, his advancing forces encountered something unexpected. A scratch defensive force of American artillery, British infantry, and whatever tanks could be scraped together had assembled a defensive position during the previous night. They had barely hours to prepare. They were exhausted, badly supplied, and fighting in unfamiliar terrain. When the German attack struck at dawn, it ran into concentrated fire that stopped the advance cold. Rommel observed the action personally. The defenders, assembled from scattered units that should have been too disorganized to fight effectively, held their ground with a cohesion and determination that impressed him. After hours of fighting that produced no breakthrough, Rommel made a decision that surprised his subordinates. He ordered a withdrawal. In his journal, Rommel recorded an assessment that contradicted the triumphant reports being sent to Berlin. The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class, he wrote. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock, and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance by grouping their reserves to defend the passes and other suitable points. This was not the assessment of a commander who believed he faced a permanently inferior opponent. This was the analysis of a professional soldier who recognized that his enemy was demonstrating a capacity for learning. The Americans had been beaten at Kasserine, beaten badly, but they had shown resilience that gave Rommel pause. What happened in the weeks after Kasserine confirmed his concerns. The American military establishment launched a systematic effort to understand exactly what had gone wrong. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, ordered comprehensive reviews at every level of command. After action reports were collected from every unit that had been engaged. Officers who had failed were identified and studied. Tactics that had proven inadequate were analyzed in detail. The institutional response was impressive in its thoroughness. Within weeks, the lessons of Kasserine had been documented, distributed, and incorporated into revised training programs. Officers who had performed poorly were relieved and replaced by men who showed more promise. Coordination procedures between infantry, armor, and artillery were completely rewritten based on what the battle had revealed. The same military bureaucracy that critics dismissed as bloated and inefficient proved remarkably effective at processing failure and implementing corrections. On March 6, 1943, General George S. Patton arrived in Tunisia to take command of the demoralized Second Corps. Patton was everything the defeated American forces needed at that moment. He was aggressive, demanding, and supremely confident in himself and in the American soldier. He believed that American troops, properly led and properly motivated, could defeat any enemy in the world. He intended to prove it through action rather than words. Patton descended on his new command like a force of nature. He imposed discipline through sheer force of personality. Soldiers who had let their standards slip during the chaotic retreat found themselves being fined for uniform violations. Officers who had failed to maintain control of their units were publicly humiliated and relieved. Training intensified dramatically. The slack, demoralized atmosphere that had contributed to the Kasserine disaster was replaced by demanding standards and constant pressure to improve. But Patton did more than simply impose discipline. He studied exactly why the Americans had failed and implemented specific tactical corrections. Artillery forward observers were repositioned to provide better coordination with infantry units. Tank tactics were revised to avoid the ambushes that had destroyed so many American vehicles at Kasserine. Combined arms cooperation between infantry, armor, and artillery was drilled repeatedly until it became reflexive rather than improvised. The transformation happened with a speed that defied conventional military wisdom. Units that had broken and run at Kasserine just weeks earlier began to develop confidence in themselves and their leaders. Soldiers who had fled from German tanks learned tactics for fighting them effectively. The same men who had been humiliated in February were preparing to go on the offensive in March. Rommel recognized the danger this transformation posed, but by early March his own situation was deteriorating rapidly. His supply lines across the Mediterranean were being strangled by Allied air and naval power. The British Eighth Army was pressing from the east. His health, never robust after months of desert campaigning, was failing under the strain of continuous combat and inadequate medical support. On March 9, 1943, Rommel departed Tunisia for the last time. He handed command of the Afrika Korps and associated German forces to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. Rommel flew to Germany for medical treatment and rest, expecting to return once his health recovered. He would never set foot in Africa again. This timeline matters because it contradicts one of the most persistent myths of the Second World War. Popular culture has long portrayed Rommel and Patton as great rivals who faced each other across the battlefield in epic duels. The 1970 film Patton showed the American general defeating Rommel at the Battle of El Guetar, even depicting Patton watching the battle unfold through binoculars and declaring triumphantly that he had read Rommel's book on tank warfare. The reality was entirely different. Rommel and Patton were in Tunisia simultaneously for exactly 3 days, from March 6th when Patton took command to March 9th when Rommel departed. During those 3 days there was no significant engagement between their forces. The famous Battle of El Guetar did not begin until March 23rd, a full 2 weeks after Rommel had left the theatre entirely. The German forces that Patton fought at El Guetar were commanded by von Arnim at the army group level, with General Major Friedrich von Broich leading the 10th Panzer Division in the actual fighting. Rommel himself was in Germany when the battle occurred, recovering from exhaustion and illness hundreds of miles away. The Allied command did not know that Rommel had departed. German headquarters kept his absence secret to maintain morale and confuse enemy intelligence. So when American troops fought at El Guetar, they believed they were fighting the legendary Desert Fox. Newspapers reported it as a showdown between Patton and Rommel. The myth of their battlefield rivalry was born from this misunderstanding and would persist for decades. The Battle of El Guetar proved crucial for American military development regardless of who commanded the German side. On March 23rd, Patton's Second Corps attacked German defensive positions in the narrow valley east of the town of Gafsa. The terrain was challenging, with rocky hills channeling any advance into killing zones that the German defenders had prepared with their usual professional efficiency. The German response came swiftly and violently. On the morning of March 23rd, the 10th Panzer Division launched a counterattack aimed at crushing the American advance before it could develop momentum. Approximately 50 German tanks rolled toward American lines in formations that had shattered enemy defenses across Europe and Africa. The tank crews expected to break through as German armor had at Kasserine just a month earlier. They had done this before. They knew how green troops reacted to the sight of panzers bearing down on them. This time, the result was completely different. American anti-tank guns, properly positioned on high ground with clear fields of fire, engaged the German armor at long range. Artillery forward observers, working with procedures, developed specifically in response to Kasserine failures, called in concentrated fire on the attacking formations. Infantry held their positions instead of fleeing. The coordination between branches that had been catastrophically absent at Kasserine now functioned effectively under pressure. The German attack ground to a halt in the rocky valley. Tank after tank burst into flames or threw tracks on the broken ground. The 10th Panzer Division lost between 30 and 40 tanks in the failed assault. By the end of the day, the American lines remained firmly intact, and the German counterattack had been thrown back with heavy losses. The Battle of El Guetar was the first major engagement where American forces decisively defeated experienced German panzer units in direct armored combat. The soldiers who had fled at Kasserine had learned their lessons in just a few weeks. The tactics that had failed so badly in February had been revised and improved and drilled until they worked. The American military system had processed its failure and emerged demonstrably stronger. Rommel followed these events closely from Germany through official military reports and correspondence with former subordinates still serving in Africa. What he learned confirmed his earlier assessment. The Americans were not a permanently inferior enemy who could be dismissed with contempt. They were a learning organization that was rapidly closing the gap in combat effectiveness. Given time and experience, they would become truly formidable. In May 1943, the North African campaign ended in complete Axis defeat. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered to the Allies, more prisoners than had been taken at Stalingrad. The Afrika Korps that Rommel had commanded with such distinction for 2 years ceased to exist, and the American forces that had been humiliated at Kasserine were among the victors. Rommel drew conclusions from this experience that put him at odds with the Nazi leadership in Berlin. While Hitler and his inner circle attributed American success to material abundance alone, Rommel recognized something more significant. The Americans possessed an institutional capacity for learning and adaptation that made them increasingly dangerous over time. They studied their failures systematically. They adapted their tactics based on combat experience. They promoted officers who performed and relieved those who failed without sentiment. Given time, they would become opponents that Germany simply could not defeat. The contrast with German military culture was stark and troubling. The Wehrmacht excelled at executing predetermined plans with devastating efficiency. German tactical doctrine was superb, and German soldiers were extensively trained. But the Nazi system actively discouraged honest assessment of failure. Officers who reported bad news risked their careers and sometimes their lives. Disagreeing with Hitler's strategic judgments was dangerous in the extreme. The information that reached Berlin was filtered through layers of people who told the Führer what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. Rommel experienced this dysfunction directly and personally. His reports from North Africa, which honestly assessed German weaknesses and Allied strengths, were often dismissed or simply ignored. His requests for reinforcements and supplies went unfulfilled. His warnings about Allied material superiority were treated as defeatism rather than professional military judgment. The disconnect between battlefield reality and the fantasy world of Nazi headquarters grew wider with each passing month. A particularly revealing incident occurred on October 1st, 1942, months before Kasserine, when Rommel travelled to Germany to receive his Field Marshal's baton from Hitler. During discussions with the High Command, he tried to explain the reality of the situation in North Africa. British fighter bombers, he reported, were destroying his tanks with 40mm cannon shells. The Allied advantage in the air was becoming decisive. Goering, the Luftwaffe commander, interrupted him with undisguised contempt. "That is completely impossible," he declared. "The Americans only know how to make razor blades." Rommel's response captured his frustration with leaders who refused to face facts. "We could do with some of those razor blades, Herr Reichsmarschall," he replied. The exchange illustrated the gulf between Rommel's professional realism and the ideological fantasy that dominated German strategic thinking. Goering dismissed American industrial capabilities because Nazi racial ideology required him to dismiss them. A nation of racial inferiors, mixing different ethnicities in ways that violated every Nazi principle, could not possibly produce effective weapons. The evidence of the battlefield was simply irrelevant to men who had already decided what must be true. Rommel did not share this delusion. His assessments of American capabilities were based on observation rather than ideology. He recognized that the material superiority the Allies already enjoyed would only increase as American factories reached full wartime production. He understood that Germany was fighting a war of attrition it mathematically could not win. The numbers told an inescapable story. In 1943 alone, American factories produced over 37,000 tanks, while German factories produced roughly 11,000. American shipyards, using revolutionary assembly line techniques that traditional shipbuilders had declared impossible, were launching Liberty ships faster than German submarines could sink them. One yard in California built a complete cargo vessel in 4 days. American aircraft factories produced planes faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down or train pilots to fly against them. The scale of American production defied comprehension. By the end of the war, American factories would produce nearly 90,000 tanks, over 2 million military trucks, and close to 300,000 aircraft. Germany, for all its vaunted engineering prowess, could not approach these numbers. The Wehrmacht that invaded France in 1940 relied on 2.8 million horses for logistics. American forces arrived in Europe with fleets of trucks that never tired, never needed fodder, and could be replaced from factories running around the clock. Consider what these numbers meant in practical terms. 300,000 aircraft would stretch wingtip to wingtip for thousands of miles. The The fuel to fly them required an entire petroleum infrastructure of tankers and pipelines and refineries. The crews to man them required training programs that processed hundreds of thousands of young men. The entire American economy had been reoriented toward war production, with a speed and thoroughness that German planners had declared impossible. The industrial differential was not a gap that could be closed through effort or ingenuity. It was a fundamental strategic reality that Rommel understood and that Nazi leadership refused to accept. Germany was attempting to defeat enemies who could outproduce them by ratios of 3 to 1 or more. Every battle cost the Wehrmacht resources it could not replace. Every American loss was made good within weeks by new equipment from factories that seemed to have no limit. In his letters to his wife Lucy, Rommel expressed views he could not safely voice through official channels. "The enemy air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements," he wrote from Normandy in June 1944. There is simply no answer to it. By late 1943, Rommel had been assigned to inspect the Atlantic Wall, the system of fortifications defending Western Europe against Allied invasion. In January 1944, he took command of Army Group B, responsible for defending the French coast from the Pas de Calais to the Loire River. For the first time since Tunisia, he would be preparing to face American forces in combat. His preparations for the expected invasion reflected his hard-won respect for Allied capabilities. Rommel believed that the only chance to defeat the landing was to destroy it on the beaches within the first critical hours. Once the Allies established a beachhead and began landing their vast reserves of men and material, German forces could not prevail. The material superiority of the enemy would be decisive in any extended fight. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, Rommel wrote, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. In every battle to come, the strength of the Anglo-American Air Force would be the deciding factor. On April 22, 1944, during an inspection of beach defences, Rommel told his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, words that would prove prophetic. "Believe me, Lang, the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive," he said. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day. When Allied forces landed on June 6, 1944, the question was whether German defenders could throw them back into the sea before they consolidated their positions. The failure to do so sealed the fate of the Western Front and ultimately of Nazi Germany itself. Rommel was not present when the landings began. He had travelled to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, believing that weather conditions made an immediate invasion unlikely. By the time he reached the Normandy battlefield, American and British forces had already secured their beachheads. The opportunity to defeat the invasion in the crucial first hours had been lost forever. Over the following weeks, Rommel observed American military performance at close range for the first time since the Tunisia campaign. What he saw confirmed and exceeded his earlier assessments. The American forces of 1944 were vastly more capable than those he had defeated at Kasserine Pass. Their coordination of infantry, armour, and artillery had become highly effective. Their air support was overwhelming and continuous. Their logistics delivered supplies and reinforcements with an efficiency that German forces could not begin to match. The American style of warfare impressed and troubled Rommel simultaneously. When American infantry encountered a defended position, they did not simply assault it with courage, as German doctrine often demanded. Instead, they called for artillery support. The fire that followed was not a few rounds, but hundreds, sometimes thousands of shells falling in concentrated barrages that pulverized defensive positions. When the infantry finally advanced, tanks supported them. When tanks were stopped, aircraft were called in. The Americans had learned to integrate combined arms in ways that multiplied their combat power while minimizing their casualties. German soldiers who survived engagements with American forces reported that the experience was fundamentally different from fighting the Soviets on the Eastern Front. The Soviets threw men at problems and accepted enormous casualties to achieve objectives. The Americans threw machines and firepower. Why risk soldiers, American doctrine seemed to ask, when you could expend ammunition instead? The outcome was similar, overwhelming force applied relentlessly, but the American approach preserved their trained soldiers, while German losses could never be replaced. Rommel also noted the psychological effect of American abundance on German troops. German soldiers, fighting with rationed ammunition and watching supplies dwindle, faced opponents who seemed to have unlimited resources. American positions featured hot food, plentiful ammunition, and medical support that evacuated wounded men to hospitals within hours. German wounded often died waiting for treatment that never came. The material disparity was not just a tactical disadvantage. It eroded morale in ways that compounded every German setback. In his official reports to Hitler, Rommel documented the hopeless mathematics of the Western Front with brutal clarity. German forces were suffering casualties of 2,500 to 3,000 men per day. They were receiving barely 10,000 replacements total. The calculation was simple and merciless. Within weeks, German defensive capability would collapse, regardless of how bravely individual soldiers fought. On July 15, 1944, Rommel sent what would be his final report to Hitler through military channels. "The troops are everywhere fighting heroically," he wrote, "but the unequal struggle is approaching its end. It is urgently necessary for the proper conclusion to be drawn from this situation." This was the closest Rommel could come to telling Hitler directly that Germany had lost the war. Drawing the proper conclusion meant seeking peace before total annihilation. Hitler, predictably, had no intention of accepting such advice. He would fight until the Reich collapsed entirely around him. 2 days after sending this final report, Rommel's war effectively ended. On July 17, 1944, Allied aircraft spotted and attacked his staff car on a road near the village of Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery in Normandy. The strafing run left Rommel with multiple skull fractures, a fractured cheekbone, and severe injuries to his face and left eye. He was pulled from the wrecked vehicle unconscious and barely alive. His driver, Sergeant Carl Daniel, died from his wounds that same night. The surgeon who examined Rommel expressed astonishment that any man could survive such injuries. Rommel did survive, but his active military career was finished. He was evacuated to Germany to recover, never to return to command. While he convalesced at home in Herlingen, the war he had warned was lost continued its inevitable course. Allied forces broke out of Normandy in late July. Paris fell in August. By September, Allied armies stood on the western border of Germany itself. The American forces that Rommel had assessed were proving exactly as capable as he had warned they would become. The soldiers who had struggled at Kasserine had become veterans who could match German formations in mobile warfare. The industrial capacity that Nazi leaders had mocked was burying the Wehrmacht under an avalanche of tanks and aircraft and ammunition that Germany simply could not match. But Rommel would not live to see the final defeat. His peripheral connection to the July 20th assassination attempt against Hitler had marked him for death. Officers implicated in the bomb plot had mentioned his name under interrogation. One conspirator had listed Rommel as a potential head of state for a post-Hitler government. Whether Rommel had actually agreed to participate in any conspiracy remained unclear, but the Gestapo had accumulated enough suspicion to make him a target. On October 14, 1944, Generals Bergdorf and Meisel arrived at Rommel's home in Herlingen bearing an ultimatum from Hitler. Rommel could submit to arrest and trial before the People's Court, where conviction was certain and his family would suffer retaliation. Or he could take a cyanide capsule, receive a state funeral as a hero who had died from his wounds, and his wife and son would be protected from persecution. Rommel chose the cyanide. He explained the situation calmly to his son Manfred in the hallway of their home. "To die by the hand of one's own people is hard," he said. "But the house is surrounded and Hitler is charging me with high treason." When Manfred asked if they could fight their way out, Rommel shook his head. "There is no point," he replied. "It is better for one to die than for all of us to be killed in a shooting affray. Anyway, we have practically no ammunition. In view of my services in Africa," Rommel added with bitter sarcasm, "I have been given the opportunity to die by poison. The two generals have brought it with them. It is fatal in 3 seconds." His final recorded words to his son concerned a fellow officer whose fate under the Nazi regime remained uncertain. "Manfred, I think Speidel is also finished," he said. "Take care of Frau Speidel." Then he walked out to the waiting car, swallowed the poison capsule, and was dead within minutes. He was 52 years old. The regime he had served announced that Field Marshal Rommel had succumbed to his wounds from the July strafing attack. Hitler sent condolences to the widow. A state funeral was held with full military honors, the elaborate ceremony obscuring the truth of how Germany's most famous general had actually died. The papers Rommel left behind would eventually reveal his professional assessment of American military capabilities. Published in 1953 as the Rommel Papers, edited by British military historian Basil Liddell Hart in collaboration with Rommel's widow, the collection included journals, letters, and official documents that had survived the war. Among these was a passage that would become widely quoted. In Tunisia, the Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, the text read, but it brought rich dividends. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces, although we had to wait until the Patton army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare. This assessment, praising American generals as tactically advanced and capable of astonishing achievements, stood in sharp contrast to the contempt that had characterized Nazi thinking about American military capabilities. Historians have raised questions about certain passages in the published papers. The text referencing Patton's operations in France describes events that occurred after Rommel was incapacitated and then killed. The exact circumstances of its composition remain uncertain. Editor Liddell Hart was later criticized by some scholars for shaping the memoirs of German generals to support his own historical interpretations. What remains beyond dispute is the overall pattern of Rommel's documented assessments throughout his time facing American forces. His contemporaneous journal entries from Tunisia recorded genuine respect for American defensive capabilities, even while celebrating tactical victory at Kasserine. His letters to his wife documented his recognition of Allied material and air superiority in stark terms. His official reports warned repeatedly of the impossibility of defeating enemies who could replace their losses while Germany could not. Rommel assessed American forces based on professional military judgment rather than ideological preconceptions. He recognized their rapid improvement after initial failures. He understood the strategic implications of American industrial capacity. He warned his superiors, accurately and repeatedly, that Germany could not win a prolonged conflict against the Western Allies. This professional realism made Rommel unusual among senior German commanders. Many continued to dismiss American capabilities, even as American forces drove them back across France and into Germany itself. They attributed their defeats to material factors alone, refusing to acknowledge that American military leadership and tactics had improved dramatically since the early setbacks. The story of Rommel's assessment matters because it illuminates a larger truth about the conflict. Germany was not simply outproduced, though that was certainly true. Germany was outthought at the strategic level by leaders who refused to accept evidence that contradicted their assumptions about racial superiority and national character. Hitler believed what he wanted to believe about American weakness because his racial theories required it. He dismissed battlefield evidence because it contradicted his ideology. He surrounded himself with advisors who told him what he wanted to hear. He punished those who spoke uncomfortable truths. And he led Germany to catastrophe because he could not accept that his fundamental beliefs were wrong. Rommel understood that winning wars required honest assessment of both your own capabilities and those of your enemy. He saw that the Americans who struggled at Kasserine were not the same Americans who would fight at Normandy. He recognized the learning, the adaptation, the institutional improvement that transformed a Green Army into a formidable fighting force. Those warnings went unheeded. The regime that demanded ideological conformity could not accept professional military judgment that contradicted the Führer's beliefs. The catastrophe Rommel predicted came to pass exactly as he had foreseen. Rommel was not a hero in any moral sense. He served a criminal regime and fought to extend its power. His legend has been complicated by decades of historical reassessment that has stripped away post-war myths about his supposed opposition to Nazi atrocities. He was a product of his time and his nation, complicit in the system he served. But his professional judgment about American military capabilities proved more accurate than the assessments of his superiors who remained comfortable in Berlin. He recognized what they refused to see. That industrial capacity could be mobilized with revolutionary speed. that an army which learned from its failures would eventually surpass one that punished honest reporting. The German generals who dismissed American forces were not stupid men. They were professionals who let preconceptions override evidence. They saw an America that matched their prejudices and ignored the America that actually existed. They paid for that blindness with the destruction of everything they had built. Nations still make these mistakes. Leaders still convince themselves that rivals are weaker than evidence suggests. The cost of such willful blindness remains as high as it was 8 decades ago. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more of these accounts from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with our channel. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans and their families to history enthusiasts everywhere. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.